My name is Roger Berkowitz, and welcome to the Hannah Arendt Center Virtual Reading Group. Today, we're going to be reading Hannah Arendt's essay, Tradition and the Modern Age. This is the first essay after the prologue in her book, Between Past and Future. This is a collection of essays, and as a collection of essays, it's often not considered to be one of her books, and yet it is. It's as we talked about in the discussion of the prologue. She very much sees these essays as a common, as having a common thread, and they are, as she argues in the preface, exercises in thinking at the time of the break of tradition, when tradition has lost its ability to set the terms and contours of the way we think and understand the world, and thus revealed what she calls this gap of between past and future, where man must think without the guide rails of tradition, as she sometimes, at one point, puts it, thinking without banisters. The first few essays in this book deal with this break in tradition and the question of history. They're the most abstract and difficult of the essays in the book, insofar as they deal a lot with philosophy and the history of philosophy. And I know that can be hard for people who don't have that background. But I think they're super important and interesting. I hope you had a chance to listen or watch the lecture I offered to all of you. Let me just emphasize what I take to be the three-part movement of this essay that I hope will simplify it. And it wasn't in the video introduction, so this will be new. The start of the essay is that there is a tradition. The tradition in the West more or less has its beginnings with Plato and Aristotle, and specifically with the periogoge, the turning of the soul that Plato describes in his analogy of the cave in Book 7 of Plato's Republic. And the core of that idea in the cave is that the way we typically see the world with our eyes, our physical eyes, and our senses is a world of shadows, a world of darkness, and it's not true. And that the truth is up there. It's a supersensuous, ideal truth of eternal verities, and Plato calls these the ideas. These ideas are true eternally, and everything that's in the world is always a mere copy of and one that will decay and therefore not true. Aristotle, Plato's student, adds to this description and says that therefore man is an animal rationale. That's the Latin translation. In the Greek, he says that man is a zoon logon echon, which means he's an animal, a zoon, from our word zoo from the zoon, an animal that has logos or logon, which is a difficult word that can mean both speech and reason, but it's what gathers the world together. Its actual root in Greek is from furrowing and farming. It's the gathering and tilling of the soil to form something in common. And so that's the tradition, that man is this rational animal who's distinguished from other animals and all other living beings by the primary quality that he has logos, that he thinks. That's the tradition that she says is coming to an end or has come to an end. And there's two different ways that it comes to an end. The first way is conceptually, philosophically. And so if the tradition has its philosophical beginning with Plato and Aristotle. It has its philosophical or conceptual end in Marx. She thinks Marx is the key, but she actually names three thinkers that bring it to its conceptual end: Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. And she, at all parts in the essay, discusses all three of them. The basic argument here is that if the Platonic inversion or turn was the turn away from this world to a world of true ideas, Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche are a second turn away from the true world of ideas back to this world. So for Kierkegaard, we turn away from the truth of God to man's concrete suffering and his faith, but one that is always doubtful. And for Nietzsche, we turn away from man as a rational animal to man as a willing animal seeking power, a will to power. And for Marx, we turn away from animal rationale to what Marx calls the animal laborans, the laboring animal, an animal who is socialized and lives in society. And there are no true values, what there are social values. And so in this turn, the second turn, a number of things happen. The idea of truth as eternal, the Platonic idea, is undone. We no longer have eternal truths because truths are not up there, they're in the world. The trust in things as they appear is undone. We no longer can take for granted that when you stick a stick in the river, it's bent, it looks bent. We understand that the way things appear is always not what they really are. Being is beyond appearance. We no longer have trust in revealed truth from God. Even the Kantian idea and the Enlightenment idea that truth is a product of reason, that man's reason can yield universal truths, is undone. And the result of this, as Arendt says, is that truth becomes a working hypothesis. Or in other words, truth becomes a mere value. It's something that's not true. It's something we decide upon socially, democratically, through our own socialized values. We decide what our ends are. And the result is that truth is no longer true, it's valuable. And so this is the undoing of truth that Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche all recognize is happening and articulate in their own ways. And this is the end of tradition conceptually. And yet, Arendt says, even when tradition ends conceptually, most of us don't understand or read Nietzsche, Marx, and Kierkegaard. And so the value, the idea of man as a rational animal, the value of truth continues to exist. And even though it doesn't have real power in our society, we actually submit to it because we're scared of losing it. We're so scared that the value would disappear and we don't have truth. We hold on to it, and the value can actually become even more powerful, but in a tyrannical way, because we know it's not true, and yet we obey it anyway. And it becomes not something that we are persuaded by, but something that we live according to. The third step, which is not talked about so much in this essay, but is simply highlighted and mentioned, is that the conceptual end of the tradition of animal rationale, that ends with Marx, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard, has a factual end, not in a theoretical event, but in a deed, in a factual event, namely totalitarian domination that emerged in Germany during the National Socialist period and in the Soviet Union during the Stalinist era. Here was a situation in which we didn't simply conceptually understand that man is not a rational animal, or in another formulation, man is an end in himself, therefore can never be used as a means. We lived it. Man, under the totalitarian domination, becomes something that can be destroyed, something that can be killed simply to serve ends. Yeah, we always had wars and we'd always killed people, but it was not Arendt is arguing because we simply saw man as disposable. Man is now only useful insofar as he serves ends, and to the extent men don't serve ends, are superfluous, or killing them will lead to other ends, we have no qualms about killing them. So we move from the idea of nihilism in Nietzsche and Marx and Kierkegaard, that anything is permissible. We can sort of have any values. There are no highest values. That's nihilism, right? The devaluing of all highest values so that all values are equal. To what she considers to be the motto of totalitarian domination, which is not that anything is permissible, but anything is possible. Not only is it permissible, it can happen. And we have simply no ability or need to stop it from happening because we don't actually believe that human life is valuable. I mean, is more than value. I mean, has dignity outside of its exchange or use value. So I'm sorry, I wanted to go over the structure because it is a complicated essay. I thought I'd sort of lay out that structure. And so the claim here is that tradition has ended conceptually with the rise of the modern age in the 18th and 19th centuries, and to a large extent, it's even ended factually with the rise of totalitarian domination. And we now find ourselves in this gap between past and future, where we have to think for ourselves for the first time, she argues, since Plato and Aristotle, since the Greeks. And that is an enormous shift in in the human activity. So that's the challenge we face. And these essays that we're going to read are what she calls exercises in such thinking. Okay, I apologize for sort of a longer idea here or introduction, but I thought I'd get it out there. Let's see if there are questions or comments. Remember to turn your mic on if you have questions. I'm happy. There is one from Rhea who wrote in on Google, and she asked, I think, a very fair question. I'm struggling to understand the self-defeat of the three thinkers, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Marx. It's a fair question. This is in part 3 of the essay, which starts on page 28. And again, like I said, these are complicated thinkers who are difficult. Let me try and do it this way. All three of these thinkers rebelled against the idea of the anima razionale, right? So let's just pick one, and if you want me to do 2, we can do 2 or 3. So Marx says that it's not that we are rational animals who set our active selves under our thinking selves, but we are laboring animals. We are action, and our what drives us, our highest end, is to act and make the world anew, to act into the world according to our ideas and make the world according to the way we want it to do. And so his argument is that philosophers don't need to understand the world only, they should change the world. But Marx's idea of action to change the world is supposed to end in a utopia, a communist utopia. And as such, it would make action and change unnecessary. And so what man is, a laboring, changing, acting being, would become no longer necessary, and man would, in a sense, disappear. Arendt is suggesting in Marx. So his very thinking defeats itself. Rhea asked about Kierkegaard. I'll admit Kierkegaard is the person I know least well of these three thinkers. I mean, I certainly know Marx and I certainly know Nietzsche, but as I understand it, Kierkegaard moves from revelation to doubt, and therefore man begins in belief. And yet, once you have doubt, how do you get to belief? You can only get there through faith, which is to return us back to a kind of rationalist leap. So these are the way Arendt sees these folks as self-defeating. It's a bit technical. I don't think it has a huge amount to do with the points of her essay. So maybe I can leave it there unless there are further questions. Just so I don't talk all the time, I see Bob Meyerson has a question. Bob, you want to read your question and maybe elaborate it? So my voice gets a rest.
Can you hear me?
I do, Bob, yes.
Yeah, well, to some extent, this maybe comes from Heidegger, but in a number of places, she's astounded by the achievements of science. And at the end of this essay, she references science again. She also talks about the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. But I'm just wondering if, because she references Descartes, is science where she is citing the start or maybe the takeoff of the loss of tradition?
So you're absolutely right in a number of in almost everything you said. Science is on the one hand the beginning of what she calls modern age, which she says has its beginning with Galileo and his insights that the world is not as it appears, and we can find scientific laws to know the true world that is not how it appears. And you're right to say that her understanding of science and her critique of science is deeply influenced by Heidegger. I would also say by Nietzsche. But there's and that science is absolutely key to this essay. So if we look at the last page of the essay, really 39 to 40, a little bit on 40, here's the sort of conclusion that she offers, which is that again, she says let me just start a little bit earlier on 38 at the bottom. She says that what Marx really did, and what all three of these thinkers really did, is not simply repudiate the tradition by an inversion, right? So she actually talks about it in this chapter, in this last section, section 4. She says on page 35 that there's a twofold turning operations going on here, right? The turning operations is on 35 in the middle. The turning operations with which the tradition ends brings the beginning to light in a twofold sense. So the beginning, let's remember, is the tradition. The beginning of the tradition is the cave analogy and the emergence of this idea of truth and anima rationale. And the first fold, the first turning operation, is Marx and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche's inversion of anima rationale into anima laborans and will to power. But the second, and she says the more radical, so this is on page 7. So she says the significance of Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche's challenges to the tradition is that they constitute a much more radical turning about than simply the upside down inversions. And this more radical turning about, she finally names on 38 at the bottom, as that they don't simply turn things around and value materialism, matter versus ideas. This is Marx. But what they do is they refuse the idea of man as a rational animal. And they have a radical questioning of the essence of man. And then the next sentence is on 39, since the rise of modern society, the conceptual framework of the tradition has not been secure. And this is the scientific revolution. So why does science undo this conceptual tradition? It's because what science does here is, in the end, teach us that there are no truths. Now, science, again, is born out of a desire to find the truth, right? What we realize is that the appearing world is untrue. There are laws underlying it, and so we seek to find truths that are more true than the appearing world. And yet, over time, even scientific reason, Kant's idea, the Enlightenment idea, turns out to be not universal, turns out to be based on always social assumptions and values. And so we move from a rational idea of truth to the empiricists and the utilitarians, such that truth is a value. And even, she'll argue, the natural scientists in the age of Heisenberg and Einstein come to understand that even natural science is always, insofar as it's determined by humans doing experiments, so that humans make experiments in which we seek to understand nature, even the natural scientific truths are not objective and even not impartial, but are directed by the way we humans choose to set and understand the world. And so what science does is unleashes this unbelievable will to truth that seeks to undo and expose all ways in which what we think are true are really not true. And the end point of the will to truth of science is the undoing of truth, and the will to truth kills truth. This is Nietzsche's thesis, and leads to the devaluing of all values, which is what Nietzsche calls nihilism. And Arendt agrees with that. So science is this engine that, in the name of truth, exposes the interestedness of all truths, and thus devalues all truths and leads to a kind of nihilism. Is that going to help, Bob? I don't know. I hope that helps, but if I'm happy to take a follow-up on that, because it's a hard and important point. It's a very important point.
Well,
in work.
Yeah, we don't want to end it on that note, do we? I mean, and the essay and her corpus, she certainly isn't a nihilist.
No. So the answer to that is, she believes we live in an age in which not only the tradition and the power of the tradition, which is the idea of truth and reason, has been conceptually broken and factually broken. So there's no doubt we live in what you're calling, and she would call, an age of nihilism. What she believes is that the way to respond to that is not simply like Nietzsche, Marx, or Kierkegaard does, which is to assert the values of materialism or will over and against reason or idealism, but to recognize that as humans, without tradition, we live in an age in which we have the responsibility to think and seek to find values that, even though they're simply values, we will, in some sense, embrace as common values that will become foundational for us and could, in some way, form new traditions. This is a very dangerous situation, because when we're trying to create new values, which we understand are interested, those new values could be ones that are great or evil. There's no doubt about it. And that's the danger of our situation. We are fully aware after totalitarianism, she says in the end of The Origins of Totalitarianism, and in many of her other books, we are made fully aware that the possibility of totalitarianism, that anything not only is permitted, but anything is possible, is now an ever-present possibility for humanity. And that's a possibility we have to live with, so that we have to be eternally vigilant that not be actualized again. So she's certainly not a nihilist in the sense that she doesn't want us to assert values, but she does fully accept the nihilism of our age, and that is the challenge that we are faced with. Are we all right, Bob? You want to?
Yes, thank you. I'm just thinking.
Okay. If anyone wants to respond to that, and we can do that. We have time before we move on to a next question. I mean, these are complicated issues, and these are at the very core of Arendt's thought, and I think at the core of what we're going through today. And there's no doubt that one of the ways to understand what's going on around the world with what's often called the rise of populism, right, is that since World War II, since the fact of the break of tradition, in which we realized everything was possible, we rebelled against democracy. I don't think there's any other way to understand what's happened in the last 80 years. And we tried to limit democracy with technocratic rule by experts. And that has only increased every decade from the 1950s through till today. And what we're seeing around the world is a democratic populist revolt against a technocratic, undemocratic liberalism, a technocratically imposed liberalism that is not true to the democratic spirit of the people. And the people who don't feel represented by the technocratic elites are around the world rebelling against that idea. In a way, the technocratic elites tried to impose common values, cosmopolitanism, diversity, globalization, a radical kind of equality. And they thought these were the new kind of universal values that we should live according to. And for many of us, they've become a new kind of tradition, a new unquestioned commitment that, in a sense, allows us to not think about these things and simply live that way. But what's happened is that large numbers of people around the world have not been convinced, don't accept this as their tradition, and I think you're seeing all around the world in many technocratic quasi-democracies a rebellion against this kind of elite imposed liberalism by a kind of populist democratic revolt, which is in Arendtian terms very dangerous, because one of the natures of this kind of popular revolt is that it's a movement, and as a movement, what it needs to do is assert a kind of identity which is fictional and coherent, but it, as a fictional coherent identity, it gives the people who embrace it a kind of meaning which is deeply important, and she says is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than the messiness of reality. And it's this rise of populist movements, which are democratic but and anti-technocratic, that we are now confronting today.
Roger, I don't mean to challenge this. I'm sorry, this is Jack Hirschfeld. I don't mean to challenge what it is that you just said, but I think there's a whole other way of looking at this in the context of the loss of the tradition. Tradition meaning, as you said in your lecture, that which is handed down, and one of the outcomes, one of the social outcomes that appears to be visible as a consequence of the nihilism that's identified by Nietzsche is what, in popular terms, is called decadence. And I think that you see in the 20th century and now again in the 21st century a call to tradition, that is a restoration of tradition, which would not permit the kinds of behaviors and activities that are labeled as decadent. And I don't want to say that this is a rebellion against decadence, because I think it's very much more complex than that. But I think that that's a real factor in what is happening in the world. That is, the elites are seen, as they always have been, as decadent, and so there's a kind of flexing of muscle by the people, as you call them, in resentment against the imposition of decadence in their lives.
I think that's absolutely right. I don't know if that in any way challenges what I said. I'd love to hear how it does. That one of the key chapters of the Origins of Totalitarianism is called the temporary alliance of the mob and the elite. And in that, what Arendt explores is how the decadence of bourgeois society and the hypocrisy of people who say they care about justice but really care about money, say they care about democracy but really care about power. The hypocrisy of that is not lost on either the mob or the elite. And here she's using elite in a different sense. The elite would be the philosophers and the thinkers who, in their deep distrust and criticism of bourgeois hypocrisy, find that they are aligned with the mob and in their critique of bourgeois hypocrisy, and they, in a sense, become populist demagogues who articulate better than the mob could the critique of the established status quo bourgeois society. And that's why almost all demagogues are not from the mob or the people; they're from the elite who articulate what the mob is saying in a way that the mob themselves would not. And so Trump and Orban and Le Pen and Putin and Erdogan and are in that reading elite critics of bourgeois decadence. Now we can talk about their own hypocrisy and etc. But there's no doubt that many of us agree about the corruption and decadence of the established order, which is why we're in some perverse way, and maybe not even perverse, in some way, attracted to people like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, who attack the corruption and perversity of that order. And that doesn't mean all of us want to see a populist demagogue. And by the way, a populist demagogue can be of very many different qualities. But it's not, and it doesn't, and a populist demagogue is not necessarily a tyrant or a fascist or even an authoritarian. They can often be incredibly populist, and democratic. And I actually think that one of the things we have to take very seriously right now is that Trumpism is a more democratic movement than technocratic liberalism. That doesn't mean it's right, and it just means that it's more democratic right now. Questionably, since Hillary Clinton did win the majority of the popular vote, but around the world, there's no doubt that technocratic liberalism is being experienced as non-democratic. So decadence, to come back, is a deeply, the fact, an undeniable fact of decadence is part of what allows this to happen.
I think I would add to that the capability, the scientific capabilities of our age, which has to do with I'll just bracket it, psychology and the media, which gives demagogues or potential demagogues a methodology for providing language to the mob that clarifies their unity.
Yeah, I'm gonna. That's certainly a point Arendt makes about Hitler and Stalin, in that both Stalin and Hitler were ideologues and therefore used scientific prophecies. Hitler, scientific racism, and Stalin, scientific materialism, economics, to articulate the truths of their ideology. One of the important differences, I think, between most of the populist demagogues today and those totalitarian demagogues is that the demagogues today are not ideological. Trump, as far as I can tell, and I'm pretty confident about this, doesn't seem to have any overarching ideology. I'm not. I don't know. I don't think there is one. I think in many ways, and I wrote this in a piece that some of you, I'm sure, read on Medium a couple weeks ago. What he really is a cynic who sees a great value in destroying the legitimacy of the status quo system of technocratic liberalism. What's the value in that? Well, I think on one hand, I think it's fun. I think he enjoys it. And the fun value of simply destroying a decadent system, a hypocritical system, is not to be underestimated. But I also think for people who are incredibly wealthy, the destruction of limiting public institutions is in their interests to a certain degree, because it allows private interests that are powerful to have more sway. And that may be part of, I think it's certainly part of the reason some people are supporting Trump. If I had to guess, I'm not even sure Trump is that Machiavellian. I actually think he's more just enjoys it, but I don't know. Maybe we'll turn to another question. Suzanne, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Arendt early on says that writes that she's got political thought at the center of her focus, and you also underscored the political in your lecture. So that leads me to think: is there a form of thought that escapes this need to contend with tradition and its loss? And if there is, what is that other form of thought?
Well, Arendt says we live in an anti-political age. And she means a number of things by that. But one is that politics is dangerous. In politics, we bring real plurality and difference to the fore. And especially in an age of nuclear weapons where the world could be destroyed, politics is an existential threat to humanity. Because if we actually engage in politics, and as we know, war is politics by another means, we potentially destroy all of humanity. And so she says there's a deep and abiding fear of politics in the nuclear age. And we could also say in the age of totalitarianism, because what we know is that real politics can lead to totalitarianism and can lead to nuclear Armageddon. And so there is a easy retreat from politics called technocratic governance, bureaucratic governance. Let the experts run things so that we don't run into these Armageddons. And so that's technocratic governance would be one replacement of politics. Another reason our age hates politics, Arendt writes, is that politics takes time. It means we have to spend time arguing, serving on boards, engaging in the public world. Time that most of us today would rather spend earning money or taking care of our family or watching TV, or playing internet games or whatever it is. And so insofar as what we really value is our sort of social private lives, the political life of man is something that we find as an annoyance. And so we outsource it to political representatives in democracy or to bureaucrats because we find politics annoying. And so representative governance and bureaucratic governance would be, and along with technocratic governance, would I guess be three alternative ways to govern that are different from politics.
Okay, that's all helpful, but it doesn't quite get at what I'm looking for. Okay, I'm looking for the more optimistic, I guess. I mean, is there a form of, okay, I can't help it. It's characterological. Is there a form of thinking where, remember in the preface, the notion of the treasure that we lost, right? Is there a form of thinking where we're still holding on to some of the treasure? Now, I don't think it's religious thought. I mean, at least not all of religious thought, given the role of Kierkegaard in all of this. But I don't know. Poetry, art, is there? And I don't even know what artistic thought is. But
so I think Arendt has an answer for you, but it's one that you seem uncomfortable with,
okay.
which is politics.
Right. Okay. No. That's okay.
For her, this is not pessimistic.
Right.
We are now, at the end of the essay, What is Freedom?, which we'll read in a couple months because it's in this book, she's going to conclude that it's at the end of the essay, What is Authority? She's going to conclude that authority is no longer, it actually should be called What was Authority? And she says, that's not bad, because it means we're now free to think and act in ways that can create new worlds. It's the same premise of this book, which is we're now in this unbelievable situation, which is both incredibly dangerous, but also incredibly liberating.
Mm-hmm.
And one in which, really for the first time since ancient Rome, she's arguing, when the Greek tradition was adopted and embraced and codified in such a way that it has largely been unquestioned until Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, and until then the totalitarian domination, we have an opportunity to rethink the tradition and potentially create new traditions. And that's terrifying and exciting. And that's where she sees us, in that terrifying and exciting time. We understand the impulse to turn towards bureaucracy and technocracy to avoid the terror. But what she's saying is we have to take the risk of thinking. And it's hard because we're not habituated to it anymore. We've lost the practice. We've been so hypnotized by tradition and technocracy over the last 2,000 years that most of us are unhabituated, unpracticed in what it means to think freely and to live with people who disagree with us. I mean, this is a big part of what's going on around the world right now. And to try and think without the truths, the banisters. And she thinks that's a very exciting thing. She's not blind to its dangers. She lived through them. She's well aware of the dangers. But she thinks it's imperative that we begin to learn how to do it.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. John, you want to ask your question? John Bevan?
It's not much of a question. Can you hear me now?
I do.
It's not much of a question. I'm encouraged by your call for optimism, but I just wondered whether, theoretically, whether Plato would be concerned that we were heading back into the cave.
Well, I mean, Plato thought we headed back into the cave, starting with Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, and certainly more so when we ended up with Bentham and Mill and utilitarianism, and the kind of focus on social world, the world of values, is for Plato completely cave-like. It's not human, insofar as humans are rational beings. So yes, he thinks we're in the cave. Arendt says, so what? Right? I mean, Arendt's view is the metaphysical tradition, the tradition of truth that lasted in the West, our tradition from Plato through Hegel, is dead. Give up on it. Don't call for it to come back. But don't give in to the decadence and the mere utility that and then technological utility that people who celebrate the end of metaphysics and the tradition embrace. Agree with them. The tradition's done. We can't bring it back. But we have to fight then in this world, in the cave, to somehow think in ways that inspire us to higher values that are not metaphysical, that are not true or rational or revelatory in the way that traditional truths were. And that's the battle. And it's not unimportant that the metaphor Arendt uses is the battle, right? She says the past and the future, the space of thinking is a battleground. And we have to battle for the values that are not simply materialistic or decadent values. And it's going to be a fight. And we need to be willing to fight. And the fight, though, is a fight of thinking and ideas. It's not a physical fight, although it may at times turn into one. That's where she leaves us. You said optimism. Arendt is always optimistic insofar as she thinks that man can remake the world he lives in. That's her idea of natality, which is a word that's overused. But we are free. And as long as we're free, we have the freedom to understand the situation we're in. That's the first step. And that requires profound honesty and boldness in understanding our own complicity in that situation. And we can, if we understand it, we can resist it. And that's where her optimism comes. Connell, do you want to ask your question?
Well, can you hear me?
I do.
Yeah. No, it's just I'm curious about the academic field of political philosophy. The way you phrased your opening at the beginning about the conceptual end. What does a field do when it has been announced by someone that their field is at a conceptual end?
I almost want to plead the fifth on this one. I don't think much of the field of political philosophy, although I, in some sense, come out of it. I think the field of political philosophy is lost. They don't know very much what to do, which is not a terrible critique of them. I mean, I think many of them are Marxists or Nietzscheans or Kierkegaardians, insofar as they're fighting to it. There's a part of the tradition, a part of the field of political philosophy, which is still trying to say truth is dead. Well, that's obvious to me. It's obvious to Arendt. And a lot of what they write is simply regurgitated Nietzscheanism, regurgitated Marx, and regurgitated Kierkegaard. Then there's people who think truth is dead, so what should we do? There's been other movements. I don't know how much you know. There's postmodernism, which is sort of say, well, truth is about playfulness of some sort. Arendt is very critical of that turn and that move. There's other movements today. There's the neo-materialist movement that comes out of Deleuze. There's a lot going on, but I can't explain it all. That's the field. But I think that not enough people are grappling with what I consider to be the situation Arendt presented us with, which is that we're in a post-metaphysical age. Just take that for granted. you know, what does it mean to think in that world? And that's the question Arendt asked over and over and over in her work. Part of the difference and part of the problem, I'll be very honest, and you know, a lot of you will disagree with her on this. I think I could be wrong, because I think a lot of my colleagues disagree with her on this, is that Arendt values freedom above equality. So when I say that we live in a world of undemocratic, technocratic liberalism, one of the just absolute core values of liberalism today is equality, social equality, not political equality. And Arendt doesn't think that's the case. And so she thinks the desire for social equality impinges upon freedom, impinges upon democracy, and leads to the kind of populist resentments which we're seeing around the world today. Just because we're coming to the end, I want to get in. Donna had a question. Donna, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Roger. It's less a question, more just a comment, I guess. In that this discussion I'm involved in next week is looking more specifically at opinion polls, and my suggestion is that we've become too scientific with our politics, and that this is part of what some of the resentment, I guess, is. And that aside, just listening to the discussion tonight too, I mean, I think, well, I say tonight, it's 2 o'clock here in 2 a.m. here in Tokyo. It's just this concept now of the elite. It seems to me that, and I draw on my Australian and Japanese experiences, you know, this idea of the elite needs some reconceptualization, because it seems to be thrown around in such a way that we've lost all sense of its meaning, and yet it seems to be the punching bag as part of this populist discourse. And as another thought I've been having while we've been having this discussion too, is there room to also now reconceptualize the social contract, to bring thinking back in, to bring our engagement with politics, the technocrats, the politicians again, you know, to reinvigorate that idea of the social contract, perhaps. That's all I would have to say at this stage. Thank you.
There's a lot in there, Donna, and thanks for getting up at 2 a.m. every month for this. I appreciate it. There are many different elites, and you're right, the word is being thrown around and used irresponsibly, and it's hard, you know, that's not always a critique, it's just hard. I think if you look at someone like a populism of Bernie Sanders, it's aimed at a corporate elite, right? If you look at a populism of someone like Trump, I think it's aimed at what we might call a technocratic elite, and even a moral elite. He loves thumbing his nose at the hypocrisy of political correctness, which would be called a moral elitism, and also, you know, I don't know what he thinks of the technocratic elite, because he wants to bring all these sort of business folks and somewhat technocrats in, but there's a lot of also anger at elites who think they can make the world better and fix it, and that's sort of the technocratic elite. So I think we do have to distinguish the different elites that are at issue here. And in many ways, I mean, science plays a number of roles in these discussions. On the one hand, on its largest, most metaphysical realm, science is the will to truth that undoes the tradition through the work of people like Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. They're all scientists, and their science leads them to nihilism. On a more pedestrian level, science as technology, which is a very different idea than that other kind of science, is the idea that we can technologically make the world safe and workable. I mean, this ideology has its modern beginnings, I think, in John F. Kennedy's kitchen cabinet in the 1960s, and is most highly represented today in Silicon Valley, right? With this idea that we can use big data to, in a sense, make the world safe and good. And that if we can just get all the data, we can solve all the problems. I think that's another way that science, or in the sense of technology or technocracy, is being used today. One last thought. I see Bob asked a question. If tradition has been lost and has come to an end, the only proper role of philosophy is a historical one, a review of the past that has been aufgehoben. Well, that was Hegel's view, but I don't think that's Arendt's view. I think for her, philosophy is about learning how to think, and that's what these essays are about, learning how to think, exercising and thinking. And so philosophy becomes not a discourse about the love of truth, but a love of thinking and an exercise in thinking. Okay. Thank you all. Someone has loaded shared their screen. I don't know what happened, but I hope you can all hear me. I very much look forward to reading with you the next essay on the concept of history. It's long. Make sure you give yourself time to read it. It's a complicated essay, but it's really good. And I look forward to talking with you again next month. Have a very happy holiday season. Take care.